Good Friday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for December the 29th. Today, we are going to be reading Esther chapters 9 and 10. And once we conclude with that, we will say that we are done for our scheduled read through 2023. We've been looking this year at the history text of the Old Testament, which have hopefully strengthened the foundation of understanding that we have for Scripture as a whole. Get any sort of book and you just begin reading in the middle of it, kind of like what we do whenever it comes to the New Testament. Well, you've got a whole half of the book that you don't know about, and it probably is going to tell us a little something about that second half of the book, you would think. And that's what the Old Testament does for us, specifically the first quarter or so of the Old Testament, that is the Old Testament history text. They give us a foundation. They tell us about where we come from and why the world is the way it is and what God is doing about the problems that have been created in the beginning. And really for us, what it has done is it has helped to really lead us up to the time of Jesus coming into the world, because we know that we've read basically from the beginning of the creation in Genesis 1 through about 400-ish BC, which at that point is going to begin the 400 years of silence where God does not speak through prophets or anything like that. And then at the turn of time, you might say, when we switch from before Jesus being here to now Jesus is here, we get into Jesus' story. And so much of what he talks about gets back to what happens in the Old Testament and in the history of God's people, dating back to Abraham and even before that. So again, there's so much that I hope our reading has done for you. I like to describe our understanding of Scripture as often being a canvas of some sort of a drawing. And as we read through Scripture and we come to understand it better, what we are doing is we're adding color to it, we're adding paint to the canvas, which continues to grow, I think, all throughout our lives as we continue to read and study and apply the text to who we are as God's people. So again, I hope that this year really has benefited you in a tremendous way. Let me get Esther up on the screen and we'll read along together here in Esther chapter 9 and verse number 1. Again, we'll read Esther chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 10 only has like three verses, so it shouldn't be an overly long read today, but this will bring a good conclusion to the story of Esther that we've been reading over the last few days. So let's begin here in chapter 9 and verse number 1. Esther chapter 9, verse number 1, picking up from the edict that was written by Mordecai that allowed the Jewish people to be able to defend themselves against the edict that was written by the evil Haman. So this is the second edict. The king's command and law, the second edict written by Mordecai, went into effect on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month Adar. On the day when the Jews' enemies had hoped to overpower them, just the opposite happened. The Jews overpowered those who hated them. In each of King Ahasuerus' provinces, the Jews assembled in their cities to attack those who intended to harm them. Not a single person could withstand them. Fear of them fell on every nationality. All the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the royal civil administrators aided the Jews because they feared Mordecai. For Mordecai exercised great power in the palace, and his fame spread throughout the provinces as he became more and more powerful. The Jews put all their enemies to the sword, killing and destroying them. They did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the fortress of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, including Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vaizatha. They killed those 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. However, they did not seize any plunder. Take note of that. They did not seize any plunder. On the day of the number on that day, the number of people killed in the fortress of Susa was reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, "In the fortress of Susa, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, including Haman's 10 sons. What have they done in the rest of the royal provinces? Whatever you ask will be given to you. whatever you seek will also be done. Esther answered, if it pleases the king, may the Jews who are in Susa also have tomorrow to carry out today's law, and may the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be hung on the gallows. Verse 14, the king gave the orders for this to be done. So a law was announced in Susa, and they hung the bodies of Haman's 10 sons. The Jews in Susa assembled again on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not seize any plunder. The rest of the Jews in the royal provinces assembled, defended themselves, and gained relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not seize any plunder. They fought on the 13th day of the month of Adar and rested on the 14th, and it became a day of feasting and rejoicing. But the Jews in Susa had assembled on the 13th and 14th days of the month. They rested on the 15th day of the month, and it became a joy of feasting and rejoicing. This explains why the rural Jews, there we go, who lived in the villages observed the 14th day of the month of Adar as a time of rejoicing and feasting. It is a holiday when they send gifts to one another. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to all the Jews in all of King Ahasuerus' provinces, both near and far. He ordered them to celebrate the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar every year, because during those days the Jews had gained relief from their enemies. That was the month when their sorrow was turned into rejoicing, and their mourning into a holiday. They were to be days of feasting, rejoicing, and of sending gifts to one another and to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the practice they had begun, as Mordecai had written them to do. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them. He cast the pur, that is, the lot, to crush and destroy them. But when the matter was brought before the king, he commanded by letter that the evil plan Haman had devised against the Jews return on his own head, and that he should be hanged with his sons on the gallows. For this reason, these days are called Purim, from the word pur, because of all the instructions in this letter, as well as what they had witnessed and what had happened to them. The Jews bound themselves, their descendants, and all who joined with them, to a commitment that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days each and every year according to the written instructions and according to the time appointed. These days are remembered and celebrated by every generation, family, province, and city, so that these days of Purim will not lose their significance in Jewish life, and their memory will not fade from their descendants. Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote this second letter with full authority to confirm the letter about Purim. He sent letters with assurances of peace and security to all the Jews who lived in the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, in order to confirm these days of Purim at their proper time, just as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had established them, and just as they had committed themselves and their descendants to the practices of fasting and lamentation. So Esther's command confirmed these customs of Purim, which were then written into the record. King Ahasuerus imposed a tax throughout the land, even to the furthest shores. All of his powerful and magnificent accomplishments, and the detailed account of Mordecai's great rank, with which the king had honored him, have they not been written in the book of the historical events of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai, the Jew, was second only to King Ahasuerus. He was famous among the Jews and highly esteemed by many of his relatives. He continued to pursue prosperity for his people and to speak for the well-being of all his descendants. And that is the reading of Esther chapter 9 and Esther chapter 10, and concludes our read through the text of Esther. So what we read yesterday about the letter, the edict that allowed for the Jews to defend themselves, we now see being carried out in chapter 9, that the Jews initially were going to be on the receiving end of great destruction. But we have this phrase in towards the end of verse number 1, that on the day when the Jews' enemies had hoped to overpower them, here's our reversal language, just the opposite happened. The Jews overpowered those who hated them. So, whereas for many months, those who had hated the Jews were preparing for Jewish destruction, now we see the reversal happening and the enemies of the Jews being the ones to suffer destruction themselves. Not a single person could withstand them. Fear of them fell on every nationality. So basically, possibly some of those who had planned to destroy the Jews maybe backed off their plans, thinking, yeah, might not want to do this. They seem a bit more formidable than we thought initially, because now, again, we have to remember from the edict, they had the government's backing. And that's seen in verse number 3, that all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, governors, or royal civil administrators, they aided the Jews because they feared Mordecai. Because Mordecai had grown into this very strong position, obviously aided by his connection with Esther and the fact that he had delivered the king from the assassination attempt all the way back in chapter 2, I believe it was. So he had great power in the palace. He had great fame. He becomes more and more powerful, the text tells us. And it was really his edict that he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus that allowed for all this to take place. So verse number 5, the Jews put all their enemies to the sword, killing and destroying them. They did what they pleased to those who hated them. And even in the fortress of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, including that I'm assuming, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, these 10 are the sons of Haman. But notice what is said at the end of verse number 10. Notice what is said at the end of verse number 15. Excuse me. Notice what is said at the end of verse number 16, that even in the destruction of their enemies, they did not take plunder. Going back to chapter 8, we noticed how plunder was something that was actually allowed by the edict that Mordecai had written, along with killing women and children. But those things do not seem to be discussed here. Just the straight killing of anybody and everybody they wanted to, and also the plundering of these other peoples. That doesn't take place. Specifically and explicitly stated is that they did not take any plunder. So this for them was not about gaining wealth. It was purely about self-defense in defending their nation, defending the Jewish community. So in verse number 11, the king talks to Esther. I've seen what you've done. I've heard about the success. Is there anything else you want to do? She said, well, why don't we hang Haman's sons on the gallows? And we might be thinking, well, that's kind of vindictive in a real way. But you have to think about what that would mean, what the visual significance that would give to other people. That, hey, not only was Haman hanged on these, but his sons are hanged on these. If that's what happens to the enemies of the Jews, maybe I might want to reconsider my own hatred of the Jews and any plans I might have for fighting against them and seeking their destruction. So on the 13th day, and also on the 14th day, that was another thing that Esther said, please let us extend this one more day. The Jews stand up and defend themselves. And then the days after that, for the rural Jews, the 14th day was a day of rejoicing. For those in Susa, it was the 15th day because, again, they had an extra day. And this rejoicing that took place on the 14th and 15th day ends up actually being a holiday that they're going to commemorate that we'll talk about here in just a second. Mordecai, verse 20. sends out these events to all the Jews in the land, making sure that they are aware of what has taken place. And again, God is not mentioned here, but I have a sneaky suspicion that a lot of the language that's used in describing these things is look what Yahweh has done for us. Look how God has provided for us in so many ways. And the emphasis here is that it's during these days that the Jews gained relief from their enemies. Now, there's a little bit of background here in language that ties in with what we see back in chapter 3 and verse number 8, where Haman says, you should not, speaking of the Jews to Ahasuerus, you should not tolerate these people. There's some language in Hebrew here that's pertaining to roots, where the language of tolerate is very similar to the language of rest or to gain relief. So do not allow these people to rest. Do not allow these people to gain relief. You should not tolerate them. But that's reversed. And here it says explicitly that they were able to gain relief or gain rest from their enemies. So what Haman, again, the evil plan that Haman had for the people ends up not taking place, and again is reversed in a very strong way. So Haman tells about how this needs to be something we need to remember going forward. And verse 23 tells us that the Jews continued or agreed to continue the practice they had begun as Mordecai had written for them to do. And then you have a brief summarization of what had taken place, that Haman was enemy of all the Jews. He had plotted against the Jews to destroy the Jews. He cast the pur, that is the lot. Again, in my mind, a close thing for us would be like he cast the dice in some way, just pure chance. Or I guess we would think pure chance, but probably Haman is thinking that his gods are directing what's going on with the casting of the pur. So his gods are determining what's going to take place. And again, this was all to crush and destroy the Jews. But when the matter was brought before the king, and just as the king, so we're thinking Ahasuerus, right? He commanded by letter that the evil plan Haman had devised against the Jews return on his own head, and that he should be hanged with his sons on the gallows. Give me just 1 second here. But if we think back in the story, it wasn't Ahasuerus who suggested that he be hanged on the gallows or his sons. That was a different individual. Specifically, his name Harbona was the one who talked about hanging Mordecai, and then Esther suggested that the sons be hanged as well. So what's going on here? Well, this seems to be some sort of an official recording for the Medes and Persians. So you want to give the king as much credit as is possible. But think about this as well. It just says the king. So we assume Ahasuerus. But what if this was written in such a way in which we could think about it a little bit deeper? What if the king here is Ahasuerus? Yes, in this world, pulling making commands and such. But what if there's a recognition that's meant here about the ultimate king, Yahweh? For it could be said of Yahweh for certain that when this was brought before Yahweh, that he commanded for the letter of the evil plan Haman had devised against the Jews to return on his own head, and that he should be hanged with his sons and gallows. I think there might be something there to think about. Who is really in control? Well, who's really in control is Yahweh. Haman thought it was his gods controlling the pur, but it's really Yahweh, isn't it? Yahweh's the one who controls all things. So in celebrating these days of Purim, which is the im at the end, it makes something plural. So it's basically the celebration of lots being cast is what this means. The idea, I think, there then is that they are rejoicing then in Yahweh's control over all things. That Haman thought that his evil plans were going to prosper, but in the end, the reality is that Yahweh's plans are the ones that prosper. Yahweh is in control, and he delivered his people and allowed them to come out on top and to not be destroyed when that had initially been the plan. So these days, are remembered and celebrated by every generation, family, province, and city. So these days of Purim will not lose their significance in Jewish life, and their memory will not fade from their descendants. They need to remember what God had done for them and how he had delivered them in this strong and important way. So this is something that was meant to be carried forward. Mordecai talks about it. Even Esther commands that this needs to be done, and that they need to be written into the record so that all were aware of the expectation. And then chapter 10 kind of shows us something interesting where life just gets back to normal. Yeah, there was this tremendous victory that the Jews had, but guess what? Taxes still have to be paid. King Ahasuerus imposed a tax throughout the land, even to the farthest shores. All his powerful and magnificent accomplishments and the detailed accounts of Mordecai's great rank with which the king had honored him, have they not been written in the historical record? Yes, they have. So Mordecai, the Jew, was second only to King Ahasuerus. He was famous among the Jews and highly esteemed by many of his relatives. He continued to pursue continued to pursue prosperity for his people and to speak for the well-being of all his descendants. Well, that's great. That's good. But that just kind of leaves us, I don't know, it's almost like a cliffhanger, and it just ends right here. There's nothing else that really brings great closure. I guess in some ways this is closure. But if you're a Jew reading this, you recognize that there's still some things left undone, which is kind of like what we see in the story itself, where, yeah, Haman's been killed, but there's still the issue of the edict that was going to be carried out against the Jews. So, yeah, things are better for the Jews now, but what about the fact they're still in captivity? That's something to consider. But even more importantly, what about the Messianic king? Well, that's even more important to consider. Now, of course, for us, the way the text is laid out, this ends the historical portion. So we're left on a kind of a quirky cliffhanger. But we know that this story fits into, more than likely fits into the Ezra, Nehemiah timeline. So this comes before, more than likely, the return of the Jews to the land. So keep that in mind, that the way it's written really, and the chronology of it all, it could fit into a better place. But those are still questions that at the time people are still thinking about. What about captivity? What about the king? Yes, God has delivered us from this in this moment, from this particular trouble. But what about the greater trouble of captivity? What about the great promise of hope of the Messianic king? And of course, it's going to be 500-ish years after this that the king is going to come about, but in a much shorter time, we're going to see them return from captivity. So that's Esther, the book of Esther. Again, it's an interesting text, having no mention of God written whatsoever, at least explicitly mentioned within the text, but certainly the keen eye is able to see God working all throughout this text, and how he continues to show his faithfulness to his people, and how people can continue to show their faithfulness to him. If you have any questions about the text of Esther and what we read today, please feel free to leave it in the comment section below. And again, I really hope that our read for this year of 2023 has been beneficial to you. I hope that it has been a blessing. I hope that you, again, can say that you have a better understanding of God's word, having read through it and thought through some of the things that we bring out of the text during our daily reads. And again, if you have anything to add, you have any suggestions for next year or anything like that, please feel free to put that in the comment section or reach out to me personally. That'll be just fine as well. I'm looking forward to reading through the Psalter with everybody here in 2024. We'll be reading on average about 3 Psalms a week. We're going to do a Monday, Wednesday, Friday reading, I believe is what I've determined we're going to do. I will have a little booklet for you that's going to, excuse me, that is going to have the read schedule for next year. It's going to be a normal sheet of paper folded in half that will have ways for you to indicate that you've been able to do those reads. So I'll have that to hand out on Sunday for those who would like to participate in our read for 2024. And we'll do similar to what we did this year. Some of the preaching that I'll do will be from the various texts that we read through. And then we'll just have as much discussion on the Psalms as we can. Hopefully, again, that will be a blessing to you as well. Again, thanks for tuning in today. Hope you have a great rest of your Friday, great rest of your final weekend of excuse me, 2023. Hopefully 2024 will bring about much less coughing and issues like that. But again, we'll be back at it again on Monday, January the 1st, reading together in Psalm number 1. Hope to see you then. Hope to see you in 2024. Take care and God bless.